Unlike the majority of my videos, this one is not going to contain an especially detailed breakdown of the plot of House of the Dragon Episode 1. Though there will, of course, be spoilers, you are warned. This isn't so much down to laziness on my part, as it is due to the lack of a plot to break down. There is a difference between plot and plotting, broadly analogous to the difference between setting up a game of chess and playing a game of chess. Now, this isn't necessarily a point of criticism. There will be some of that later, but there will also be some praise. It is, however, something to note. Episode 1 is much more concerned with putting the pieces in their proper places than it is doing very much with them. There are maybe 3 actual developments we can call story progression. King Viserys is ailing, his pregnant wife dies in childbirth, and the child not that long after her, leaving Viserys with no male heir. He's been feuding with his brother, Prince Daemon, who is next in line to the throne, as well as the commander of the City Watch, and an all-around royal dickhead. Daemon's taunting of Viserys' dead son forces Viserys to strip him of his position as heir, which Viserys then hands to a young Princess Rhaenyra, with a warning about the trials, tribulations, and, well, it is a Game of Thrones show, so the winter to come. And that really is it, as far as the main plot is concerned. Of course, this is a throne show, and so the episode is chock full of intrigue, interaction, hints at subplots, character relationships that will, presumably, slowly build into plot points of their own, and if that happens, we will cover those in subsequent videos. But that is if it takes a similar approach to story, as Game of Thrones did, and that is a question to which we shall return. The only other thing perhaps worth mentioning at the moment concerns an alliance of free cities that is forming in the background, that potentially threatens the stability of House Targaryen, but again, it is difficult to say that much more about this at the moment, because although we know it will be important, we do not yet know precisely how, and it would be fruitless to guess. We will come onto that in much more detail when we get to episode 2, which will in turn have a much more thorough breakdown of plot, because that is the point at which the plot in fact starts to unfold. Now then, back in the before times, I was in the peculiar position of being an admirer but not an adorer of Game of Thrones. Even that admiration grew slowly. I took my time getting into Westeros and the world of George R.R. Martin's imagination, sumptuously, but at times I thought, certainly during season 1, quite superficially rendered for the screen. The writers weren't quite sure their audience was up to it, and they didn't think we hoi polloi could sustain lengthy and dialogue-heavy scenes without tits bobbing about in the background and vaginas being presented at every conceivable angle. The existence of abortion clinics is supposed to keep brothels unproductive, but Littlefinger's establishment birthed an awful lot of the first season's plot. If you were paying attention, my eyes are up here. Of course, it's hard not to fall into a world that deep eventually. But at a time when everyone was either raving about it or completely indifferent, I just never really developed a strong, powerful love for Game of Thrones. It was a spectacular achievement, for a while at least, eminently and self-evidently one of the most watchable things on TV. It had its stunningly beautiful and awesomely horrifying moments. It had a very rich cast of characters, competently performed for the most part, but it missed a soul. Again, not quite a criticism because it deliberately missed a soul. But if you lack a metaphysical purpose, as the show certainly did, you can find infinite ways of getting nowhere, but no one way of getting anywhere in particular. If I were being unduly harsh, I would say that Game of Thrones is the ultimate in filler TV. Being slightly fairer, it was a luscious fantasy soap opera, the point of which was to go on and on and on, always worth watching, never worth finishing. You could leap from tragedy to brilliance to tragedy, Ned Stark's death, the Khaleesi and the fire, the Red Wedding, Oberon's head going pop, freeing the slaves, climbing the wall, the Battle of the Bastards, but all these endings were designed to keep the thing going. Which is a problem Martin himself seems now to be experiencing with his writing. I'm one of those who thinks he will never finish the books, but I'll go one further. I don't think he could finish them. You cannot finish a story like Game of Thrones. What made him brilliant was the way he took the necessary inspiration from The Lord of the Rings to write the opposite story to The Lord of the Rings. His is not a derivative world, you won't find orcs, elves and dwarves, but that's the superficial stuff. George R.R. Martin is the anti-Tolkien in soul and in spirit, which is much more important. Where The Lord of the Rings rests on a basic and charming belief in the existence of good and evil, and the ultimate triumph of right over wrong, the metaphysic of Martin's world is amoral, and to the extent there is a rule, it's that the heroes will die and the cynics will survive. The cliche, of course, is Machiavelli, but Martin's inspirations can't be reduced to that one man. His inspiration is the history of man itself, the real as opposed to the romanticized truth of lords and kings and empires. Tolkien's world is innately moralistic. Martin's world is a brutal and cynical thing, and morals are your enemy. This makes for brilliant soap-style entertainment, but it also makes it impossible to bring it to a satisfying conclusion. The mistake the showrunners made, once they ran out of source material, was to assume Game of Thrones could end as any other fantasy could. It can't, and it never could. The idea that good people should be rewarded and bad people should be punished breaks the very foundations of Martin's world. The problem was, and for the writer still is, that you can't write a satisfying end to a story that precludes satisfying endings. I'll say right now that unlike The Lord of the Rings, I don't have a wealth of knowledge of the lore or the nuances of Martin's books. I have a decent enough understanding of them, I think, and a decent enough understanding of the man behind them. But you will be able to fault me on the details, I'm sure. But can you really imagine an ending to the book series? Or if you stopped at, say, season 5 of the show, could you envisage an end to that didn't involve everyone dying of a combination of maliciousness, cynicism, infighting, incest, and political paralysis, and the White Walkers zombie shuffling their way to ultimate victory? Maybe you could keep a couple of the main bunch alive to scratch a living off the cold, dead earth, but the point would have to be, misery and defeat, because Game of Thrones is not a story in which the good is anything but a hindrance. Now you might be thinking, fuck, I know he says Martin will never finish the books, but will this guy ever get to the end of his fucking introduction? Well, yes, winter is here, don't worry. You might disagree with the proceeding, but I think I will get a Dothraki war cry of agreement if I say that the show derailed when it ran out of source material to work with. All the good ideas were dropped, all the villains were wasted, all the smart characters had their personalities assassinated, and then were quite often killed off in body as well. From clever machinations, it devolved into crass and often inexplicable stupidity, culminating in Season 8, the most crass and most stupid of all. Being an admirer but not an adorer, I can't claim I was especially affected by that shit show. It was evidently nonsense, catastrophe-fucking stupid in places, a betrayal of everything that went before it. The analogy would be someone who was never a massive Star Wars fan, but could see from the outside what The Last Jedi was, and what crimes it had committed. I know some people, perhaps some of you, who will refuse to watch any new entry to a wrecked story because you cannot unsee its end, and I sympathize with your position. I can well see why. And time and viewing figures will tell whether you are in the majority. Normies being what they are, however, which is a constant letdown, I strongly suspect you are not. And a few things besides normies work in favour of House of the Dragon. Its budget, obviously, though that seems increasingly unremarkable given massive budgets seem to be commonplace these days. But more importantly, and unlike seasons 7 and 8 of Game of Thrones, it has recourse to Martin's source material again. Modern screenwriters only really fuck things up, so the less they have to create themselves, the less damage will generally be done. Finally, we are far enough away from season 8 that its stink has in part drifted away, or perhaps the mass audience has just adjusted to it. But not so far away that we've all forgotten what the series as a whole achieved. To have 5 exceptional, or at least comfortably good seasons out of 8 is an astonishing hit rate in modern media. While a lot of the negative attention has justly been drawn away by Rings of Power and the continuing farce that is the MCU. As with Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon hasn't arrived as a known commodity or as the focus of anyone's attention. At its worst, we'll have seen it all before, it can't go lower. Raising the bar off the floor will feel like a pleasant surprise. An unextraordinary and occasionally dumb show that is otherwise well written with a bare minimum amount of competence will earn rave reviews. It will come as a pleasant shock, as we've recently seen with Prey. We can lament that the bar has been lowered to such a degree. I will continue judging films and shows as though it hasn't been, but if we're talking about the general audience's reception of House of the Dragon, well, the rules of this game are worth knowing. And so, what have we got from its first episode, besides that bare-bones sketch of the plot I've already given? Well, it's a very different approach from the off if you compare it with Game of Thrones, beginning as it does with a voiceover. We're in the middle of a reign, all our principal characters are part of the ruling faction, they are in the middle or at the end of their stories. There are, of course, dragons from the off. We are told, rather than shown, that the world is deep and rich and complex. Contrast that with Game of Thrones, to which our initial introduction, cleverly, is made entirely through either novice characters or those thrown away from home and out of comfort. This was actually a real artistic and narrative achievement, because Martin's worlds are famously intricate, nuanced, complicated, lore-rich, and full of history. This can make for an especially daunting prospect to any new viewer. But his choice of lead characters and the places he puts them in does a huge amount to help the reader and indeed the viewer. The novice hero serves more usefully as our eyes and ears than the experienced hero does. Placing experienced characters in new and uncomfortable or unfamiliar settings achieves the same effect. So, through Jon Snow we see, just as he does, the far north for the first time. Through Sansa we see the world of the nobility. Through Arya we see the underworld. Through Robb Stark we see the world of warfare. Through Tyrion we see the world of the Northmen, and then the world of King's Landing's bureaucracy. Through Daenerys we see much of the world beyond Westeros, the Dothraki, Karth, the Masters and their slaves, and through Ned Stark we see the world of power politics and betrayal. Each of these characters is new either to their role or to their environs throughout the first season, and in some cases more than others, throughout the first 4 seasons. They are just about as new to them as we in the audience are, which means that we learn about these places and these power structures and these treacherous ambitions and relationships naturally, just as our surrogate characters do. We gain their experiences as they gain them, and that allows us to inhabit the world and to share in the fate of the pawns. House of the Dragon, for whatever reason, takes the precise opposite approach, jumping into the world midstream. We will come on to some of the reasons for that later. The approach isn't without merit, but it does lose the powerful narrative hooks that the Game of Thrones approach could utilize. It does make it harder to inhabit the world from the off, it does make it harder to care about the characters, all of whom are much more advanced and involved from the off than we can be, which limits the writer's ability to introduce unfamiliar people, places, and concepts organically. I did a live stream just before recording this review, hence my voice being a bit scratchy, which had a good mix of people, some who were familiar with the books, myself, only passing familiarity, and some who have never read them at all. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the people who read the books and so had a pre-existing knowledge of these people, these places, these characters, well, they liked the show quite a lot. There was no real jarring introduction for them. But anyone with less than full knowledge of it, anyone who had only a passing familiarity with the books, or anyone who had no familiarity with them at all, found it much more difficult to get on with and much more difficult to sit through. Now, the argument might well be, well, we're all familiar with the world of Game of Thrones, so surely some knowledge transfers? But as the show itself points out in its opening monologue, we are almost 2 centuries before that world and its trappings really came to be. The era of Targaryen rule is portrayed in Game of Thrones itself as something starkly, to use a slight pun, different than the now. It's mystical, tales of dragons, myths that were once real. Game of Thrones establishes that the era in which House of the Dragon is set is a different world functionally. And so the excuse of transferable knowledge just doesn't quite hold. House of the Dragon, if it is to be half as compelling and if its world is to be half as real as Game of Thrones' was, will need to find itself an equivalently novice or out-of-place subject to serve as our eyes and ears, the brain of the audience. Otherwise, we'll just be jumping straight into the high intrigue of Game of Thrones without really being familiar with the places, settings, characters, conflicts, stakes that make the intrigue actually intriguing. And the only way around that, of course, is exposition. A lot of exposition, which House of the Dragon certainly goes in for. You can mitigate that a little bit by really playing up the calls back, or technically I suppose the calls forward, to those points of familiarity that do exist between the two shows. These can serve as anchors of a sort. So the Iron Throne, of course, that's probably the most iconic. We already know the stakes at play there. Playing up our familiarity with King's Landing would be another wise move, visiting familiar locations, portraying the stories we heard secondhand in Game of Thrones, in order to make this strange setting just that bit more familiar. The ideal, of course, would be to combine both approaches, novice eyes and familiar things, but that is not the approach taken in the first episode of House of the Dragon. We have a whole vast panoply of characters, a whistle-stop tour of the lore, explication and exposition via dialogue that is both dense and perfunctory, to the detriment of its political ramblings, which really are its reason for being, or so it seems. Now, I like political ramblings. I don't typically have that much trouble following them. But again, familiarity with the players in this game is important if it's to be made easier and more natural to the audience, and if we're expected to actually feel anything about the outcome. Game of Thrones accomplished this in a compelling way, explaining in the immediate and teasing the bigger and grander things to come, which we were then introduced to gradually. But House of the Dragon's beginning isn't as compelling as Game of Thrones' was, because it's throwing us in amongst a close-knit crowd of people whose familiarity with each other isn't something we share. Unlike the Starks at Winterfell, Ned's history with the Lannisters and King Robb, all these first threads we can pull on when we need the latter to unravel just a little bit for clarity's sake. In House of the Dragon, we don't get to see the building of relationships from the ground up, as in Game of Thrones. We don't learn to see the Lannisters through Jon Snow's eyes, for example, or Ned's implied hostility and distrust of them. We don't get the benefit of first impressions, which of course are the most potent and the longest lasting. All these characters already have had their first impressions, we simply weren't there for them. Whether you think this is a significant flaw or not, I think will depend again on whether you've read the book. I don't think it's necessarily a significant flaw, at least it's not a reason to dislike the opening of the show, but it does make the opening less effective for a general audience than otherwise it might have been, and much less effective than Game of Thrones' introduction was. It also necessitates a lot more exposition that shouldn't really be necessary in universe. Now, it's one thing for Ned to teach Jon and Sansa and Arya about the Lannisters upon their first arrival at Winterfell, but when in House of the Dragons Queen Aemma recounts to Viserys her history of miscarriages and failures to provide him an heir, well, this is dialogue the audience needs for context, clarity, backstory, but the characters actually exchanging the dialogue really shouldn't need this. We're also thrust into something akin to a civil war the show has had to set up in a perfunctory way, or at least the prelude to one. Again, you can contrast this approach with Game of Thrones when we had plenty of time to understand the motive and reasons for battles long before they happened, making us in effect party to the crime or victims of it. But here, the battle, well, that takes precedence, serving as the setup rather than the culmination. It's used as a shortcut to introducing Matt Smith's Daemon Targaryen, who looks like an alcoholic Legolas, and his bloodthirstiness, his lust for violence, his implied ambition relative to the more staid and sane King Viserys, and so to skip ahead to the culmination of their feuding natures, rather than teasing it more slowly and subtly and building up to a final confrontation. This approach has merits as well as drawbacks. Of its merits, it clearly demonstrates the difference and the power at play between drunk Legolas and Viserys, and of course it saves time, which is important if you only have 10 episodes to work with. But of its drawbacks, well, we are cold spectators watching some cruel bloodletting amongst people we don't really know or care about or share a world with yet. It's also an attempt at fast-forwarding the world-building and character relationships that a longer and more confident series, again, comparisons with Game of Thrones are inescapable, well, that would have taken more time to set up both intelligibly and feelingly, in order that we understand the consequences without having them explained to us in subsequent city council meetings, which is a trope repeated a little bit too often in this episode. I'm making the Game of Thrones comparisons, but it's not as though the show isn't inviting them, for example in its first brothel scene. Brothel exposition is, as mentioned, a staple in Game of Thrones' early seasons. House of the Dragons is at liberty to hark back or forward to these, but it does need to justify them unless it wants us to look at it and just think, oh look, it's doing Game of Thrones. I remember. Ditto the jousting tournament with favours handed out. A scene that really plays out almost shot for shot alike to its Game of Thrones equivalent, although without a hound. Alcoholic Legolas serves as the mountain's dramatic equivalent, in dread and in brutality, the darkness contrasting with the lighter knights of the Loras Tyrell type, albeit nothing quite as pretty. We even have the break with honour and etiquette accompanying someone's loss of temper that causes the jousting tournament to derail. Of course, it's not a precise match for the Game of Thrones scene, but it is close enough to be, I'd say, uncomfortably derivative. It's also notable, though, for the differences it reveals. Though this point has been made previously, it's another good example of it. Whereas in Game of Thrones' jousting sequence, the exposition is largely in-universe for Sansa's benefit, and so by ours to the extent we're seeing through her eyes, the exposition in the equivalent scene in House of the Dragon is for the benefit of Princess Rhaenyra, who has much more knowledge and familiarity with this setting, with the world, than we have. This means the information imparted to her is more subtle, it's more technical, it's more specific. She's not being taught the ways of the world as Sansa was, because she already knows them. Instead, she's being taught more of the subtleties of another host of characters who are apparently important, but whose list of names is growing so quickly it can be really hard to put faces or indeed consequence to them. Now, I don't want this review to sound miserablist, I'm conscious it may have done so far. I do want to hand out some praise as well, first specifically and then generally. Cutting periodically away from the joust, where the brawl is unsatisfactorily resolved and all trace is removed between cuts, we have the sequence that's garnered a bit of attention for the way it allegedly suggests contemporary political concerns, specifically the US's latest bout of episodic abortion hysteria. King Viserys is forced to choose between the life of his wife and of his unborn heir. The parallels are of course obvious if you're looking for them. This procedure occurs first without her knowledge and then without her consent, and we've all heard enough about the supposed barbarity of so-called forced birth in the modern US that you can see why this scene has encouraged people to read it politically. But I actually don't mind this scene. Now, if you're familiar with this channel, you probably can guess my opinions, but for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm actually of the opinion Roe should have been overturned because it's unconstitutional, terribly drafted, and an abrogation of states' rights. And I'm also of the opinion that the hysterical hand-wringing that accompanied its overturning was largely based on Democrats' fever dreams and attempts to whip up the base for the midterms, rather than the actual reality of the state of abortion restrictions across the states. I say all this because if you're not familiar with the channel, you might otherwise think I support this scene because I agree it presents parallels with the modern abortion argument and agree with the argument for abortion rights that some people have said the scene represents. The writers have hardly dispelled the idea that we should read the scene in this way. But if it was intended as political commentary, it is about as subtle and well done as you could possibly make it, by which I mean it doesn't jar either with its specific scene or the wider context in which it's set. These types of decisions were far from uncommon in the analogous time period in the real world. The enactment of them really was at least as bloody and cruel seeming as this. Its use here is in place, it is not forced clumsily into place. You can choose to read it allegorically if you like, but you don't have to read it allegorically. I've not read the source book in this instance, I can't tell you if it matches events in Martin's material. If it does, then so much the better. Partly because it's so graphic, but also because the stakes are so immediately and indeed preternaturally real to all of us, it probably is the most effective scene in this episode. We do actually care something of the events unfolding and the characters they happen to, even if we don't care quite as much as we would have done had they taken more time to establish these characters beforehand. Of course, if the writers have given themselves license to do political commentary, then the burden is on them to keep it as subtle as this scene, and it's a burden few writers in modern media think worthwhile to shoulder. So if it does become more common and less subtle as the show goes on, to the detriment of later episodes, we can look back on this as the first instance and yes, we'll come back and criticize it. But for now, I actually don't think the scene needs to be criticized at all, except arguably for an excess of gore. The more general praise I want to dish out is that for all its faults, House of the Dragon has a high opinion of its audience. I think the sheer amount of names, relationships, political and familial information thrust into every scene is a narrative failure. It's too much and with too much haste, but the fact the writers think the audience is capable of following it suggests they do not think we are stupid. One of the things that made the early seasons of Game of Thrones so engrossing, especially once it had got over its fondness for sex position, is that it sought to tell a serious story to serious people, and House of the Dragon takes a similar approach in this regard. It is better for writers to have too high an opinion of your audience than too low an opinion of them. The worst that can come from having too high an opinion is that not everybody gets every point, every thread of the plot that you're trying to lay out for them. The worst that can come from having too low an opinion is that your audience feels insulted and patronized and offended. That being said, I do have to come back to this point of narrative failure. The forced birth, the death of the mother, has maybe 2 minutes for its emotional impact to be felt by the audience before we are forced to move on with events. But actually, there is less time even than that for it to be felt and demonstrated by the characters involved. We jump from the joust to perfunctory funeral to another council meeting chock full of intrigue and politic, with little opportunity for what should have been a character-defining moment to actually define the characters involved in it. In fact, we see next to nothing of Rhaenyra's reaction at all. We have to be told how she's feeling by another character in another place, and even that's only as a short precursor to more plot-necessary dialogue. It's a bit like going to your best friend's mum's funeral, giving him a pat on the back and then telling him that you'll both need to catch the train at 9 the next morning to make it to Wembley for the FA Cup final. And the scene between Alicent, Rhaenyra's friend, and Viserys, who she's been sent to comfort, doesn't really do much to provide redress to this issue. It doesn't really afford that much time for us to truly appreciate Viserys' reaction to the death of his wife and indeed of his heir, because it's A, short and perfunctory, and B, unsubtly there for a different purpose than that, which is a bit of Alicent's backstory and character development. The next scene, as if to distract even further from the grief, is, of course, more sexposition, but because this show is having to condense its material, the scene has to be intercut by the explanation of its events, and the significance of those events, that takes place the day after, something that in Game of Thrones would have had likely an episode of its own to be unwound. The two scenes begin separately, the first being drunk Legolas slagging off Viserys' dead kid, the second being Viserys being told about drunk Legolas slagging off his dead kid, but they eventually bleed into one the following day, with the confrontation that sees Viserys strip drunk Legolas of his entitlements as heir. It's a significant event to be sure, and is one the show does its best to make seem significant, but it's one that doesn't land as well as it might because it is the culmination of a long and convoluted arc that has been squashed into less than an hour, accounting for the time taken by other scenes and characters. Viserys makes Rhaenyra his heir instead, and that would again have been more impactful had we actually spent any meaningful time with her across this episode. The fact that we haven't really is unfortunate, because she is the ideal character through whom we could have been introduced to all of this more slowly, more carefully. Being the youngest and the least experienced, and now she's being elevated to a new and lofty position, she's the closest thing to us in terms of her knowledge. She's the easiest, potentially the easiest anyway, for us to inhabit, and so she's the one it would have been most natural to care about and to learn through, to learn as she learns. But she's been sidelined in favor of much more abstract and less involved methods of world building that sees us introduced to this place essentially by a series of mini pole-sire lectures and debates between the great and the powerful. The moment of her anointing isn't even about her, because it's used as a double setup. First for the future conflict between King Viserys and drunk Legolas, and second, as the show's most overt call forward, as well as its most unfortunate, as Viserys warns of a winter to come that they must prepare for. A moment of foreshadowing that loses the vast majority of its force because it reminds us how terribly winter was handled narratively later in the timeline. This grand and sinister prophecy is, after all, about a winter that, in the event, will last a couple of weeks and reach a thrilling anti-climax by the discarding of the Night King by a creatively exhausted writing team that didn't know how to finish. But anyway, that is the closing scene. It brings us to the end of episode 1. Now, if you are familiar with this channel, you will have spotted that this review has a considerably different tone from most of our recent videos, and that's not really a stylistic choice on my part, but a reflection of the show itself. House of the Dragon isn't stupid, it isn't dumb, and it doesn't think we are. Its problems aren't comical, they're technical, and that automatically makes it better and more interesting for a reviewer than several months' worth of MCU offerings combined. The fact it has a deep well of source material to draw on is evident. If you compare it to the last seasons of Game of Thrones, the difference is palpable, the difference is total. This is a reenactment more than it is a creation, it's a portrayal, not an invention. This gives the world the feel of depth and makes it seem a more serious and real-feeling thing. But it's also what creates the episode's principal problems, because cramming so much depth into so short a runtime is not how you make best use of that depth. It forces the writers to condense and to speed things up, but as a result we are smothered by names, relationships, lore that is intimately known in-universe, but not to us out-universe. If you've read the book, you probably won't have this same problem in quite the same way. If you've not read the book, or if you don't remember much of it, a simple challenge I think will illustrate this point. Name as many characters as you can from memory after your first watch of this episode, and then compare it with the full list of the characters actually introduced in the episode. Can you name more than half of them? And can you explain their history? And can you make complete sense of their interactions as you've just seen them? Can you elucidate the stakes for the series beyond the bare bones of it? Now, I earlier invited a comparison between this episode and the later series of Game of Thrones, but of course, the more accurate and fair comparison is between this first episode and Game of Thrones' first episode. If you can remember that far back, which did you learn more from after your first viewing? In which time and in which world did you feel most invested? And with which did you feel most involved? Do you know as much about any of the characters introduced in House of the Dragon as you did any of the characters introduced in the first episode of Game of Thrones? Do you understand their relationships, the relationship of factions, more from watching this episode than that one? There are only 9 more episodes, and no subsequent seasons have been confirmed.
Backstabbing and scheming and arse-licking and money-grubbing. Sometimes I don't know what holds it together.
But this unknown fate is almost certainly the reason for rushing in so much content. And it will be the reason for making, reportedly anyway, several large time skips over future episodes, one, reportedly, being as long as a decade. It's not a narrative choice you make if you're confident you'll be given the time to see a long story through to its conclusion. So you can see why they made the choice. If you don't know you'll get the opportunity to tell a multi-season story, it is better to tell a truncated but complete one than to suffer the indignity of being cancelled before you've reached the end. But the result will make for a less involving, less intricate, less relatable story, with too many characters and too little time to really invest in them, and so too short a familiarity to care as much about their fate as we cared about the inhabitants of Game of Thrones. The question that's outstanding is how much the writers really want to tell a traditional story. If this is to be the whole long history of the Targaryens, or if it's at least to cover a sizable portion of that history, the writers might deliberately eschew the requirements of a character-driven story and instead present it more as a collection of myths, which would make the show not unlike, in fortunes and in trials, the Silmarillion as opposed to the Lord of the Rings. I'll probably go into that in more detail when we cover Rings of Power, but both J.R. and Christopher Tolkien doubted at times whether the whole history of Middle-earth presented as a legendarium rather than a continuous and contiguous narrative could even work as a book, never mind what they'd have made of the prospect of putting it all on the screen. Reading a legendarium is an innately different experience than reading a story, a collection of tales as opposed to a tale itself. The primary object of your affection becomes the world being built and the history that undergirds it, not at the exclusion of the characters you glimpse within, but over and above them. Now, if this is the approach House of the Dragon takes, it'll be a visual treat, and maybe, once I've come to terms with that, once I've flicked my mind over into legendarium mode, well, I actually might enjoy it. But it won't invite anything like the level of care and affection for its characters, or indeed what passes for its overarching story, as Game of Thrones did. There is less to squander at the end, but largely because there is less to be squandered at the end. Now, for all that, House of the Dragon at least invites you to return for its next installment. It's not one of those where you watch the first episode and, well, shudder at the thought of going back. And it's actually nice being able to ask these kinds of questions and to make these kinds of criticisms, because the quality of criticism is largely determined by the quality of the thing you're criticizing. So if you enjoyed the points I've raised here, if you found them interesting, well, the odds are it's because House of the Dragon has achieved the bare minimum of intriguing you itself. And that again is already an improvement over much else we've had to suffer through on TV recently. So we move on to episode 2. Partly due to the absence of plot and partly because there are only so many hours in the day, I've opted to hold off publishing this until we are a bit further into the story and the pieces have begun to move. Episode 2 begins with a title sequence, which has its merits and its demerits. The title sequence from Game of Thrones was of course a nice, distinctive technical achievement, and House of the Dragon now has its own to boast of, which operates in much the same way, albeit it's rather less lavish and revealing than its forebears, because the world of this show is very much constrained to King's Landing, meaning there are no distant lands and peoples to account for. This makes it less informative, and it might have been nice, actually, had the series marked itself out by doing things differently, such as by keeping its opening monologue in written exposition, an approach that might likewise have helped plug the knowledge gap that parts of the audience will have to compensate for. The show opens brutally, with a brief flash of a post-battle at the sea, which we get very little time to suffer, thankfully, before it cuts back to another expository council meeting. This one is to determine who will take drunk Legolas's place on the city guard, and I do feel compelled to point out again, but then again is the point, that we're getting an abundance of these scenes, and this doesn't make for a particularly gripping watch. Game of Thrones had plenty of them, of course, but spread out liberally, with much more time and many more scenes elapsing in between. This made those meetings more interesting, but also more forgiving for the audience. They weren't the show's sole means for exposition and explanation. We didn't need a council meeting at the beginning, middle, and end of every episode in order to explain the events unfolding around them. They were one tool in an impressive arsenal, while at present, House of the Dragon uses them as the principal tool in a much smaller arsenal. It doesn't undermine the show, but I would argue that it's a less engrossing form of storytelling. Corlys Velaryon seems equivalently displeased as he bursts in, complaining that he's lost several of his ships while the king spends his time dithering in court meetings. And yep, I have to agree. Corlys wants to see action taken, but Viserys only offers compensation and an offering to the bereaved families, which, needless to say, is not satisfactory. Corlys wants to go to war with the pirates, but Viserys doesn't want to risk war with the free cities who support them. Off-screen, it transpires drunk Legolas has seized Dragonstone with an army of loyalists and has been allowed to fortify it without anyone causing much of a fuss. Okay, but this is a pivotal, dramatic moment, no? Half a year has passed, we learn, since episode 1, but it would seem this show is telling its story by remove. We don't actually get to see any of this incredibly important moment as it unfolds, we just hear about it in dialogue long after it's happened. Once again, I have to ask, does this really make for a gripping show? It would be like learning about the Battle of the Bastards in a small council meeting long after it's happened, rather than watching it happen and being invested in any of the participants. Anyway, the argument continues, and Viserys says he has taken diplomatic action, and this prompts Rhaenyra to ask why he hasn't sent in his dragon riders, which she says would be a show of force, and that earns Corlys's approval but loses the approval of Viserys' allies on the court, who would prefer a much more cautious and diplomatic approach. They patronizingly decide that there are other uses for Rhaenyra and dispatch her to go and say nice things to some knights. She points out that all of the knights have apparently spent all of their time catching poachers and generally doing menial things as opposed to fighting, which is a criticism you could just as well make of the show itself, though it is of course intended to depict a kingdom that has been far too comfortable for far too long. Good times create weak men and all that. Oh, except for this fairly handsome-looking chap who she takes an immediate liking to because he's actually stuck his sword in interesting places and she would, presumably, quite like to experience that firsthand. As would we all. He's very pretty. She wants to pick him for the Kingsguard, and she gets her way over the advice of the more politically conscious advisors who would prefer she picked a knight from one of the better-placed houses. Meanwhile, Viserys is filling in Alicent on the history of House Valyrian, with the aid of a model city he's been building because I guess he doesn't have much else to do being the king. Viserys tries to tap Alicent for information on Rhaenyra, accounting in part for the time skip by explaining that she doesn't say much to him these days, and he regrets the fact. I think being charitable, we can say it's bold that the show has so steadfastly rejected the old show not tell maxim. We've been shown practically nothing so far, we've been told almost everything. Such as in the next scene, where, after a CGI panorama that isn't quite up to the aesthetic standards of the rest of the show, a slightly clumsy attempt is made to quantify the time skip in dialogue, Rhaenyra complaining that it's only been 6 months since her mother died, and informing us that people are already trying to marry her father off and replace her as the heir. The secondary problem with this approach, of course, is that, as mentioned in the segment on episode 1, we're not allowed to witness events through the eyes of any of the characters, meaning we don't develop any sympathy with the positions they find themselves in. The world building is dense and complex, but we're not allowed to play a part in it, largely because we don't get to place ourselves in the body of any of its characters as they go around building it. The approach has its merits, to be sure. It's allowing for a degree of intricacy that you can lose if you're compelled to constantly cut away to action sequences, for example. But the drawback is, we don't feel all that much when, for example, Rhaenyra has a cry and confides in Alicent about her difficult relationship with her father and what she wants of him. It's equivalently telling that when we do actually get to see events unfold and interactions take place in the moment, we are invited to actually feel something for those involved in them. Rhaenyra and Alicent's friendship, for example, is the first time since the abortion sequence in episode 1 that we feel something of what the characters are feeling. And there's the implication of hidden depth that we'd not appreciate had we just had their conversation relayed to us later. The feel of depth, such as implied character history, is just as important when filling out a world as extensive lawmaking and verbal explanation of politics. In fact, you can create the impression of depth much more quickly by implication, as we get in this scene, than you can by laying it all out in dialogue or text. Sometime later, Corlys apologizes to Viserys for being ill-mannered at the earlier council meeting, and this is an excuse for some more retroactive world building. We're told, again rather than shown, what we should already have known, what we need to know for subsequent events to make sense. A recap of the previous episode's principal plot points, the death of the Queen, the elevation of Rhaenyra as heir, and then the associated political implications. A hostile power has established a colony in a critical shipping lane, we learn. I don't want to keep harping on about the difference in approach between this and Game of Thrones, but I am constantly compelled to point out that House of the Dragon is taking a perfunctory approach to its storytelling, and telling us what Game of Thrones would have spent a lot longer showing us, meaning that we do, if we're keeping up, grasp the facts of the matter, but we don't grasp them feelingly, and we can't enjoy those little thrills Game of Thrones provided us with when, for example, it invited us to predict the outcome of the events that it was slowly building up, and either then being pleased by our accuracy or pleasantly surprised, or indeed horrified, should our predictions prove to be ill-founded. Corlys' proposal is to marry the two surviving Valyrian households together. This might, of course, have confirmed Rhaenyra's suspicions had it been broached at their awkward dinner later that night, but it doesn't come up. though the scene does do a fairly good job of playing up how awkward with and distant from each other these two characters are, though this is something we'd have understood and cared more about had we actually been shown it as it developed. Viserys is then visited by the Maesters, who are still trying to stop him rotting. Here he puts his marriage plans to Otto Hightower, played by an almost unrecognisable Rhys Ifans, who isn't fond of the suggestion, although the Grand Maester supports it. We learn the next morning that the proposed bride is about 5 years old, which is, awkward, but intentionally so. As with the abortion scene, Martin's worlds are defined by their appeals to the ugly realism of medieval-ish life, like marrying children, and quite often playing up the ways that jars with modern sensibilities, such as when the young girl says she wouldn't have to bed the king until she turned 14. We are supposed to feel uncomfortable with this, and the scene absolutely does achieve that goal. Of course, this will pose problems for Rhaenyra because of the prospect a male heir will result, as is explained to her by cold bitch Princess Rhaenys, though of course this is another example of dialogue the audience needs but the characters speaking do not, or should not anyway. Rhaenys is still irritated at having been turned over for rulership in the prologue scene of episode 1, and, again like the abortion scene, we get a threat of modern political sensibilities shining through with her speech about men sooner putting the world to the torch than letting a woman sit on the Iron Throne. As with that abortion scene, though, this is something you as the audience are allowed to choose how to interpret, which automatically makes it better for the viewer than the forced politicking of most contemporaneous shows. Meanwhile, Viserys is having another counselling session with Alicent. Like the scenes between Alicent and Rhaenyra, those she shares with Viserys create a lot more depth than could be achieved with the show's preferred tactic of exposition by dialogue, and the two effectively convey a nervous, potential, probably forbidden romantic relationship, or the terrifying and ever-denied possibility of same. It is a shame the show hasn't in fact done this more often, because the writers can create believable characters and intriguing relationships that we do in fact feel something for on the odd occasion they try it. Remember this, it becomes relevant later. They are interrupted, however, with a summons to another council meeting, where it's explained that drunk Legolas, who is still calling himself the rightful heir, is taking a second wife, and that she's already up the duff. Viserys is invited to the wedding, which is seen as a provocation. It's also revealed that drunk Legolas has a dragon's egg, which is very dangerous stuff. One thing leads to another and Viserys gets pissed off, saying he wants to lead a detachment to Dragonstone to arrest drunk Legolas, but good old Otto says that that would be far too dangerous, so he will go instead. The show then does a much better job of rendering a CGI Dragonstone than it did with its earlier panoramic, wisely choosing to set it on a cloudy, misty, overcast day that doesn't allow us to look too closely at the textures. And in fact, it does as good a job as some of the earlier CG scenes did a bad job, effectively creating an atmosphere of dark threat and mystery. Otto meets drunk Legolas on the bridge, where he hands over the king's ultimatum, essentially telling drunk Legolas to ditch his whore and abandon the fortress. He appeals to the men of the City Watch who are loyal to drunk Legolas, who has stupidly brought the all-important dragon's egg down to the bridge. Again, remember that. The dialogue, by the way, is a little too perfect throughout this show. The sentences are too well-formed, too ornate, too intricate. I pride myself in being able to speak incomplete paragraphs, but even then, and even when you're better at it than I am, there is a difference between extemporaneous speech, that's speech without notes or preparation, and reading from lines. The problem with presenting extemporaneous speech without so much as a hint of flaw or fault is that, paradoxically, it makes it more obvious that the actors are reading lines, even when they are reading them convincingly as both Ifans and Matt Smith do here.
This is an abomination. With every breath you soil your name, your house, and your brother's reign.
Our love does not know titles and traditions.
It's not only in this scene that this problem is detectable, almost any extended dialogue shows the same traits of over-preparation. Though I have again to note that it is nice being able to criticize these things, which I'll grant you are slighter concerns than overt and stupid plot holes and comically bad writing, because we're now talking about how to hone a thing with solid foundations, rather than pointing out that the foundations have been laid in a bed of liquid shit. The argument is interrupted by the emergence of a dragon, which more or less guarantees that drunk Legolas has the upper hand in this exchange, so Otto tells his men to put their swords away. But then, Rhaenyra turns up on her dragon, and a stalemate is achieved. I've been delving into a lot of the faults in this show, so I want to take the time to praise it where that praise is really warranted. This whole scene is beautifully shot, it carries the tension superbly, and the show has wisely managed to balance its use of dragons to maximize their effects. Yes, they are more common in this time period, but overexposure to them would diminish their effect. Their presence here carries the requisite weight of implication. These are extraordinary weapons that Martin himself likened to nuclear weapons. They are showstoppers, they are not cheap contrivances, they should not be used as such, and so far the show has understood this. Rhaenyra confronts drunk Legolas and gets the better of their exchange, pointing out that he would need to kill her to legitimize his heir, which he is unwilling to do, and so she forces him to give up the dragon's egg, though he does get to return to the castle. So a compromise has been reached. You could fault drunk Legolas for his stupidity in bringing the egg down with him to begin with, but it was intended as a power play on his part. He is brash, he is arrogant, he is an egotistical man with a surplus of brashness and bravado. This then means his surrender of the egg proves a point rather than being an example of plot-convenient stupidity. The subsequent scene between drunk Legolas and his wife, or his wife-to-be, does not work anything like as well, however, because she cannot act or deliver a line. She's stilted and forced, she delivers her lines without the required emotional weight or indeed any inflection, so with any luck she's going to get killed off quite quickly because she is far and away the worst performer in a cast that has until now never fallen below average in quality. Back with Viserys, he's still debating the merits of marrying the little girl, and he's advised that turning her down would probably not be a good idea because it was Corlys's plan and he'd not take that rejection well. We get a lot more politics by exposition, and again this is so densely packed in and it's so quickly delivered that it really does require foreknowledge of the books for the casual viewer to really grasp what's going on.
You should also consider that we find ourselves on the precipice of war in the Stepstones, and the Sea Snake holds claim to nearly half the realm's ships.
Who is he to act to me?
No one, Your Grace. But Driftmark makes for a better ally than it does an enemy. The Sea Snake has made a calculated reach, fair play for a man of his position. If you truly want my unencumbered opinion...
I do.
You should wed Lena Velaryon, Your Grace.
Rhaenyra returns, and Viserys gives her a brief telling off for flying off the Dragonstone without orders. Viserys backs down pretty quickly though, when she points out she managed to get the egg back, which affords him an opportunity to fill in some of the emotional gap left in the previous episode that results from the death of his wife. Though the impact is lessened once again because of the formulaically perfect dialogue, especially as it's delivered by Rhaenyra.
Your mother's absence is a wound that will never heal. Without her, the Red Keeper's lost a warmth, and I dare say it will never recover.
It pleases me to hear you say this. To know that I'm not alone in my grief.
One of the other faults with functionally pristine speech is that it doesn't allow for the faults that you'd naturally expect to creep into an emotional speech. Perfection of this type is cold and sterile, and cold sterility does not invite sympathy. That's a shame because in her scenes with Alicent, Rhaenyra has given us reason to sympathize with her. She has shown that there is something about her we can like, it's just that none of it comes across in this scene. Anyway, she accepts that Viserys will have to take another wife, so with her blessing he informs his council. But, in a plot twist that is kind of telegraphed, he declares he will marry Alicent, not whatever that little girl's name is, thus pissing off Corlys. As is so often the case with this show, this scene has as many strengths as it has weaknesses. The twist is telegraphed, but not in a bad way. We're allowed to see it coming before it comes, as we see Rhaenyra realize what's going on before Viserys delivers the line, meaning the show is engaging our emotional reactions before the big mic drop moment. That's a creditable device, because it allows us to begin to register the shock of it before the characters across the table do, and to begin to understand the weight of it preemptively, so ensuring that we do fully grasp the enormity of this announcement and we're able to put Corlys' reaction in a proper context. Of its faults, well, they predate the scene itself. We've seen Viserys and Alicent together a couple of times, and I've already mentioned that potential romantic attachment that lurks beneath the surface. But it hasn't been trailed as anything more than a scant possibility, even in the minds of the characters involved in the scenes. There is a big difference between struggling to hold back the question, do I love this person? Or even, do I feel something for this person that I probably shouldn't? And I'm going to marry this person, fuck the security of my kingdom. In other words, the show hasn't really earned this payoff. The announcement is supposed to be jarring, but it's supposed to surprise the people across the table, Corlys above all. With the information we have, though, or the lack thereof, It's surprising generally, and in a different and less appropriate way. It feels like an event that's had its build-up rushed, which of course it has and is. Anyway, Corlys is understandably pissed off about this, and he storms out of the room. Rhaenyra is too, quite pissed off. After all, this places her closest friend and confidant in the position of a potential rival, and also even a traitor, revealing as it does that Alicent hasn't been forthcoming with her about her relationship with Viserys. And if you ignore the problems I've just mentioned, this is a nice little device. This is good in the way you watch an intricate move in a chess game and appreciate the tactical significance of it. It's just a shame that the tactical move wasn't preceded by equivalently careful character writing. We cut away for a final scene, with Corlys delivering another expository history lesson as the camera pans slowly around to reveal he is paying a visit to drunk Legolas. Betrayal, how very titillating. He's trying to enlist drunk Legolas's aid in defeating the crab feeder and his merry band of pirates, so proving himself more competent than Viserys, and that's how the show closes. I am glad I waited before putting this video out. Episode 1 was, as mentioned, much more concerned with setting up the plot than with the plot itself, whereas now we've begun to see events in motion. Given the pretty significant workload coming up, I might not be able to do episodic reviews of this show, but instead a few longer installments, perhaps taking in 2 or 3 of them at a time. Realistically, I'm not going to be able to balance the day job, House of the Dragon, Rings of Power, and potentially more She-Hulk videos if you sadistic fuckers insist on asking me to carry on with those. Happily though, and as I half suspected would be the case, House of the Dragon's success in intriguing me means not only am I not dreading the prospect of returning to it, I'm actually kind of looking forward to it. It is an interesting show to review, what with it not being complete unmitigated shit. I hope that hasn't made it boring for you to listen to. It is harder to joke about shows you actually kind of admire, but as I've said, it's enjoyable having the chance to tease out more interesting points of criticism than, lol, what the fuck. Of course, it's far from a perfect show. Its 2 biggest flaws thus far have undoubtedly to be its poor character work and its need for frequent and hefty exposition dumps, both manifested in its preference for telling rather than showing. Its triumph, by contrast, is in the way it does take its audience seriously and presents us with a complex and interlocking narrative of conspiracy and subterfuge and politics that, at its best, really does hark back to the better days of Game of Thrones. At present, this balances out in a show that makes you highly interested without perhaps allowing you to really care about anyone caught up in its machinations. I think that has to be considered a shame, because it shows us in brief glimpses that it could have accomplished both had it had more time and the confidence to do so. Hopefully, over the course of the whole season, we will gradually come to feel more for its characters than we've been allowed or encouraged to do so far. But the prediction of a kind that I made after the first episode remains that this will not be a show we ever truly love, with characters we invest in the way we did with the cast of Game of Thrones. It's intriguing, to be sure, highly intriguing. It's a beguiling watch, but it's coldly mechanical nonetheless. A rich world, but a deracinated population. This will still be enough to make it comfortably one of the best things on TV, if you can get over what has to be considered an exceptionally high barrier to entry for casual fans or those lacking familiarity with and a pre-existing love for the books and the lore. And given the paucity of other offerings on TV, and the impending disaster that is Rings of Power, it's nice to be reminded that someone somewhere still sees a market for intelligent, if spiritually empty, shows. Here's hoping it doesn't culminate in a Season 8 style clusterfuck, but now I've said that, it probably will. But let's be optimistic. So far, it's not that bad.